In this video, we're going to discuss non-chord tones: the passing tone, the neighbor tone, the anticipation, the escape tone, and the appoggiatura. So first off, a non-chord tone is a note that does not fit into the analysis of a chord. Sometimes composers will write notes like this, but usually under very controlled circumstances. A non-chord tone will always introduce dissonance, and the composer is concerned with how the dissonance is approached as well as how it's resolved. Now, if you want to read about this and follow along, you can turn to Appendix C, and this is on page 125. So the first thing we talk about is the passing tone. A passing tone is a non-chord tone. That's a note that does not fit in the chord. It occurs on a weak beat or a weak part of a beat. It is approached by step, and it is left by step in the same direction. So let's listen to this example. It's a sonatina by Clementi. All right, so as you can see here, we look at measure 2, and we see a circled note, and when we look at measure 3, we also see a circled note. Let's actually take a look at measure 3 first, because that one is the most straightforward. In the left hand, we see a G triad, and we're in the key of G, so this is very clearly just a G1 chord. The notes are G, B, D. In the right hand, B, G, and then A. A does not fit in the chord, so that's a non-chord tone. So the question is, how does the composer get away with writing a note that doesn't fit in the chord? Well, in this situation, it's a passing tone. In other words, it's passing between two notes that are in the chord. So that's why we say it's a non-chord tone. It occurs on a weaker part of the beat. Notice that the G that comes in on the second eighth note is strong, and then this is weaker, and then of course that comes in on the third eighth note, the B, that's stronger as well. So it's on the weak part of a beat. It's approached by step. In other words, we go into the dissonance by step, and then we leave it by step again, and it's all in the same direction. So those are all the hallmarks of a passing tone. Another way to think of a passing tone is you have the interval of the third, and you're filling in the middle note. Now the second measure, there's a note that's circled there as well. This is a 5 chord in the key of G, D, F sharp, A. And we can see the melodies, A, D, and then C. In other words, that note does not fit in the chord, but it is on the weakest part of the beat, the third beat. It is coming from the D, which is a note of the chord. You step into it, the dissonance, and then you step out of it, that's going into the B in measure 3, in the same direction. All the hallmarks of a passing tone. You're filling the space of a third. Now, for those of you who are astute, you might say that, well, there is another explanation for this particular pitch, which often there may be. Notice that if I play a D triad in the key of G, and I add one more pitch, I actually have a 5/7 chord. And that C pitch, some people would actually just prefer to analyze that as the 7th of the chord rather than as a passing tone. In some respects, it's really fulfilling both functions. Let's move on. Let's talk about the neighbor tone. A neighbor tone is a non-chord tone. It occurs on a weak beat or a weak part of a beat, just like a passing tone. It is approached by step, just like a passing tone. Same thing so far, but here's the difference. It's left by step in the opposite direction. In other words, it returns to the note that preceded it rather than move on to a new note. So let's take a look at this piece by Mozart from his sonata. And this is in F minor. Let's give it a listen. So let's take a look at that, we see a number of circled tones in this piece. Usually we like to take tones that are non-chord tones and circle them so that we can identify them. In the very first measure, we're in the key of F minor, and we have an F minor chord. That's a one chord. F, A flat, and C. And the melody is C. But then it goes to D flat, which is clearly not in the key. It's in the key, but it's not in the chord. So it's a dissonance, a non-chord tone. It's the weak part of the beat compared to where the C came in at the very beginning. It's a non-chord tone. I stepped into it. I didn't keep going in the same direction. I returned back to the original chord tone. That's the hallmark of a neighbor tone. It's just a neighbor. You go and visit your neighbor, then you come back home. Look at this voice. We could call this the alto voice. We have a 2 chord, a G, a B flat. There's actually a 7th up here, but don't worry too much about that. Here's the G chord tone, moves into a non-chord tone, the A flat, back to G. That is again the hallmark of a neighbor tone. Stepwise into a non-chord tone, reverse direction, and go back to the chord tone. Take a look at number 3. This is in measure 2. We're going to call that a passing tone. It's a non-chord tone, but notice that it didn't change direction. It kept going in the same direction. Let's move on to measure 3. This is a 5 chord, C, E, G, and the melody looks like it's in the bass right now. So the C moves to a note that's not in the chord. That's a dissonance, non-chord tone. Then it reverses direction and it goes back. So, neighbor tone. Let's just, before we move on, let's look at number 5. There are actually 2 notes there, and those notes both seem as though they're not in the chord of the C, and they're both moving up into notes that are in the 5-7 chord. So we could say that these 2 notes, the F and the A flat, are actually passing tones. They're 2 passing tones. Here we go. Let's talk about another non-chord tone. This is a anticipation. An anticipation is a non-chord tone. It occurs on a weak beat or part of a beat, just like the other 2. It is approached by a step or a leap. That's a little different. And it stays on the same pitch, and it is resolved as a result of a chord change. In other words, it anticipates a chord that is about to change. Let's take a look at this piece here. This is Beethoven Sonata Opus 49, movement number 2, movement 2. We're in the key of G. Let's take a look. Again, we're looking at the circled pitches. The first one we'll look at is the in that upbeat measure, we have a G chord, G, B, D in the left hand, and we're in the key of G. That's a 1 chord, and the melody is G, a chord tone. But then it moves to F sharp, which is not in the chord. It moves to a non-chord tone. And it doesn't ever move back or keep moving. Instead, it just stays there because in that first full measure, that note actually is a note of that next chord. The next chord, this is the first full measure, is D, F sharp, A, and C. That's a 5-7 chord. So the F sharp is part of the chord. The idea is that the anticipation, just as the name implies, anticipates the next chord. It comes in too quick. It goes to the new chord too quickly. So when it first comes in, it's an anticipation. And now it's a chord tone. And notice we also have another anticipation there. The chord is 5-7. the melody at the end of the measure moves to G, which is not part of the chord, but it is part of the next chord. See how the anticipation tends to push the music forward. Measure 3. In measure 3, can you take a look at those circle tones and tell me what they are? They are not anticipations. The chord is still a 5 chord. That's not a chord tone, but then it moves back to D. I hope you said that's a neighbor tone. And then keep going. It goes to C, which is, well, maybe a chord tone, but let's say it's not a chord tone. And then it keeps going to B. I hope you call that a passing tone. All right, let's take a look at the escape tone. An escape tone is a non-chord tone. It occurs on a weak beat or a weak part of a beat, just like the other ones. This one is approached by step, as the other ones, but here's the big difference. It is left by leap in the opposite direction. Let's see how this works. We're in the key of C. This piece by Mendelssohn. Well, to get an escape tone, you actually have to go all the way to measure 4. So let's skip over there. We're in the key of C. We have a G, B, D, F. That's a 5/7 chord. The melody is just G. And then D. Those are notes of the chord. But then you have a note that is not in the chord. It's E. So notice that we stepped into a non-chord tone on a weak part of a beat. And then to resolve it, because non-chord tones always resolve into a consonance, it skips down to the C. So it is approached by step, and it is left by leap in the opposite direction. A lot of folks, when they see an escape tone, what they're really seeing is, if you look at the whole measure in the melody, it's G, D, forget about the E for a minute, and then C. D is on its way to C, very simple. The escape tone sort of escapes out of that simple scale-wise passage. That's how I think of it. I'm really just stepping down, but the escape tone escapes out of that simple motion, gives me a dissonance, and then resolves downward. You can go ahead and look at measure 1, and maybe you can see what kind of a non-chord tone that is. Do you see it? And that one as well. And measure 2. So you step into a non-chord tone, and then you step back in the opposite direction. Hopefully you call that a neighbor tone. And in measure 3, we have a chord tone, and then a non-chord tone, and then a chord tone, where it keeps going in the same direction. Hopefully you call that a passing tone. And here's the last one we're going to talk about in this video. It's called an Appoggiatura, which is a interesting word to spell. It's got 2 P's and 2 G's, and if you were to look that up in an Italian dictionary, it sort of means to lean on, or something. The notes are leaning. Here's the definition. It's a non-chord tone. Now this is important. This is quite different than the other ones. It occurs on a strong beat, or a strong part of a beat. That's probably why it's called appoggiatura, or leaning on the beat, because it's very different than the other ones. It's in a very strong location. And it's approached by leap. That's all that is pretty impressive. And it's left in the opposite direction stepwise. So let's take a look at this. This is a sonata by Beethoven, Opus 26. Let's listen. Goes on from there. We're going to just skip ahead a little bit and actually just find the appoggiatura, which we're going to find in the 4th complete measure. The key is A flat, the chord is A flat, and in measure 4 we see that the melody note is not A flat, C, or E flat, but it's actually D flat. That's the wrong note. Notice from the previous measure, it started on the melody was A flat, B flat, and then it leapt up to the D flat. That's very bold to leap up to a wrong note, really, is what it is, a non-chord tone. And so now what's the composer supposed to do? Should really resolve it. What the composer does is goes back in the opposite direction and lands on the chord tone. So that's what an appoggiatura does. It happens on a strong beat or strong part of a beat. It leaps into the dissonance, and then it changes direction and steps back into the chord tone.